is going on, folks? We have another week of the Tread podcast. I am Nick Karaskevich, and today, for once, Facebook has not killed our feeds for season 2, so we are streaming live across everywhere right now. So this week, we have brought back exactly what everyone has asked for. Season 1, we only had one Arachnid episode, and people said we wanted more, we want more, we want more. Well, I have brought you more. And I have brought you a little bit more on top of that with some amazing Venom research. Brandon Russell from Arachnid Rarities and Verve Biotech. How are you doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. So, let's kind of break it down for people, because I think most people, obviously, when we talk about, the arachnid hobby and stuff, we got a lot of people that are, they collectors, they understand, new worlds, old worlds. But realistically, from, I think, a Venom perspective, even, I think a lot of people don't realize, the different types of, Venoms are basically, kind of going on there. I know we were talking a little bit before the show, obviously, your background with, obviously, microbiology and all of this, all these words that frankly, I don't even understand from a biology sense. But, when we're talking about, Venom as it relates to arachnids, are we just talking about things like neurotoxins and cytotoxins, or are there other either enzymes or certain peptide chains or something that kind of come into play here?
Yeah, so majority of those toxins are more of a neurotoxin, and obviously there are some more, toxins that can cause necrosis or cytotoxicity, but those are there's less species that have those, right? For scorpions, for instance, the majority of our neurotoxins, we do have some cytotoxic activity from Hemoscorpius lepturus that's out of Iran. And some of those species aren't well studied because of their location, both geographically and geopolitically, as far as having access to some of those areas, to collect and research those species. So there's definitely some obstacles in that regards, just to obtain and have access to some of those for studying. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting field. I'm mostly grew up a reptile kid that did keep a few spiders here and there. So the bulk of my childhood was more on the reptile side. Now I've found myself more on the arachnid side of things. I still dabble in the reptiles.
Yeah, and kind of, with that, when you win and kind of made that jump to arachnids, I knew you before, we even, met and kind of created the connection there at NARBC here in the spring. I had known of your, brand Arachnid Rarities and stuff for scorpions. People always said, man, this guy is one of the guys that is one of the most, complete scorpion collections you'll see in some of the different species. He's the guy you want to go to. Is that what got you in, or was there a specific type of tarantula, spider, or, megalomorph, or whatever it may be that kind of got you, hooked onto the arachnid side?
Yeah. So kind of to back up what I mentioned, I kind of go through and explain how I got to the point of, being more arachnid keeper. Again, most of my childhood was reptiles. As I went through and I still so my first time that I kept a spider was that I caught a black widow when I was in 5th grade when I lived in San Diego.
Okay, yeah.
And so that really hooked me on spiders, was just catching that. And then soon enough, I had a garage full of all these critter carriers that I was catching black widows and putting into. I'd go to school, I caught black widow spiders at my school. And it made them shut down the playground because there was black widows in the playground, and they didn't believe me at first until they had somebody come in and actually take a look. And so I always had just, that aspect, but there was really no access as a kid to for me to get a lot of arachnids. So I just was mostly snakes with a few lizards here and there. But as I graduated high school, went off to college, right, I had to think about my education career. So I really dialed back significantly on my collection, and really, I had a few hundred reptiles. So going from that down to, maybe 5 or 10 that I really, really liked. and really focused on my education. And also, I had started a family early, so I went to Iowa State University and studied microbiology. I had my bachelor's in microbiology. Then it was kind of figuring out the next step. I wanted to do some kind of graduate school, so I found a job. I graduated a semester early, and so I was trying to find a job for that kind of gap semester before doing some kind of graduate school. So I got a job at a small startup company developing swine vaccines.
Okay.
And kind of cutting edge mRNA vaccines is what they were developing, which is kind of what we now have today for some of the COVID vaccines.
Right.
It's kind of derived from that technology. And so back in 2008, that was kind of, I was working for a company on the cutting edge of some of that technology. And from there, really kind of exploded more from microbiology to more immunology, and then started doing graduate school on immunology work. So I worked for a small startup company doing pretty much everything from research discovery to manufacturing to regulatory, all the pieces with a kind of small startup biotechnology company I was a part of. So I did that for a few years before then taking a job at a large animal health pharmaceutical company.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of still nothing to do with the reptiles or the arachnids.
All right.
But so another few years, 5-6 years of doing that. My kids, I've got 3 kids, so my kids at the time were kind of somewhat interested in reptiles here and there. So we still had a few things.
Yeah.
But ultimately, what it came down to was I was on this career path as a research scientist at a big pharmaceutical company, doing really well. But to be honest, I was, it wasn't fulfilling enough for me. I wasn't satisfied with kind of what I was doing. And I wanted more creative freedom from a research standpoint, which is difficult to do when you basically have like a marketing team telling you what you need to work on and what not to for product development. So at that point, I kind of made the decision that I wanted to start my own company. So I really didn't know what that even looked like at that point. In fact, that was just something I wanted to do. And that was something that I had considered as a possibility of what I wanted for a future too, even like back when I was an undergrad too. So I made that decision. And like I'm literally having, just casual conversations with my family about like, okay, we want to do this. What should it look like? What should it be? And it was in the wintertime. I was driving home and he would have been, probably like 5 or 6 years old at the time. My son in the back seat. And he goes, "Why don't you get Venom from Black Widow's, Dad?" Like just random.
Yeah.
And I thought about it and I was like, that's not a half bad idea.
Yeah.
And so then I just kind of started looking into exploring that concept more of considering to basically intertwine my kind of professional, expertise that I've acquired along with a passion of when I was a kid. And that kind of jump started the idea after looking into and doing a lot of research, reading about stuff that the direction I wanted to go was to create a biotechnology company with the focus of studying venom.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I just put it here at the bottom of the screen, rolling across on the ticker, folks. I mean, if you guys haven't, checked it out, I mean, for me, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, but this is, for someone obviously that spent almost my entire life working in some type of discipline of sciences. But I mean, I don't think a lot of people realize, obviously, the amount of between whether we talk about any type of medical research, whether that be for, animals, vaccine, cures for cancer, et cetera, on down the list. I mean, a lot of that comes back to, the breakdown at a molecular level of using, some of these different types of venom. I mean, is that correct or to some degree?
Yeah. There's such a complex, it's such a complex liquid. There's so much going on from a protein to an enzyme standpoint. And there's so many species and variability into what those proteins and enzymes are. So it's kind of like an undiscovered treasure trove of a lot of stuff that's at least to be characterized and analyzed for possible use.
Yeah.
So my big push on it was seeing that there was a huge gap in kind of developing products for treatment and then diagnosing envenomations from reptiles or arachnids, and even some sea life to some extent. And so my primary goal was to look at developing innovative and novel treatments.
Okay.
And so like anti-venom, an anti-venom that is cheaper, more stable, in areas where they don't have, refrigeration or can deal with variations in environmental temperatures. Because, it's a limited resource for a lot of these countries that have huge issues with snake bites, scorpion stings, where a lot of, healthy adults are maybe not necessarily dying, but, getting injured so much the fact that it compromises their ability to contribute to their economy. So there's all these aspects that, for me, I saw was an underserved area in research. Not a lot of funding at that time was being used for that research. So that was kind of where I wanted to kind of focus on pursuing. So how I ended up with more arachnids than snakes in regards to venom research, because they're both equally fascinating to me. But it was very clear early on that if I needed snake venom from a species, there's plenty of places I could go in the United States and purchase that venom from for a reasonable price. There wasn't anywhere to really purchase arachnid venom. And if there was, it's not cheap. And so that really was like, all right, well, I need to start, getting my own arachnid venom, right? Because I want to use this for research, then I need to have my own stuff. So that really is what started kind of building this collection, if you will, was just for research purposes on getting these species that I'm interested in studying, and then raising them up for venom extractions.
And I'm really curious about this because I think a lot of people have probably seen, obviously, like, and we see it all the time on, whether it's National Geographic or something, they'll go through and show how people are, milking the vipers for venom and stuff. But I mean, for things like arachnids and scorpions, I mean, is it a similar process, or is there a different extraction process for actually getting it to be able to process?
It is a little bit different. And there's a reason why it's expensive, because to be honest, it really sucks to do. It's, with scorpions, you're trying to figure out a way to safely, hold them in a manner or trying to think of another word, not necessarily hold, but kind of constrain them in a manner where you're not going to injure the scorpion. Right? You're not going to hurt yourself or put yourself at risk from getting stung. And then you're essentially using like a forceps that delivers a very low voltage that you kind of put onto the tellus on where the stinger is. That helps express the venom from the venom gland. And then you're collecting in a small tube or a capillary tube. With spiders, it's even more challenging, especially something like a black widow or some of these true spiders with their very, very delicate bodies. So for that, you're actually using carbon dioxide to kind of sedate the spiders or tarantulas. And then you kind of have a contraption which holds them in a manner, and using a dissecting microscope, you're going in and isolating out those fangs, delivering a low voltage to express that venom into a kind of collection container. So
I mean, that's got to be.
And you don't get a lot.
I was gonna say that's gonna be pretty wild. I mean, how many roughly? I mean, right now, how many different species, one, do you work with across your collection, and then two, how many of those species have you done research against? I mean, because I mean, I see you work with everything from scorpions to huntsmans to black widows to all sorts of different tarantulas, new worlds, old worlds, you name it. I mean, it's a pretty extensive list. I mean, when you go on the Arachnids Rarities site and you just even see what you're openly, readily keeping available, and I know that that's a small fraction of the whole thing.
Yeah, so I keep and maintain roughly 125 to 130 species of scorpions.
Holy cow.
And then probably 50 to 70 species of tarantulas, spiders, and then centipedes too. So in a lot of those, like, it's still like an ever evolving, and my goal is to kind of establish these in my facility where I can continually raise up enough and keep reproducing them over time.
Right.
So that's been the bulk of it, is just trying to establish, because as you imagine, like, it's a pretty big expense to purchase these animals and keep them. And so, and that's actually kind of how Arachnid Rarities came about, was just trying to look for a way to kind of help subsidize those costs. And to be honest, I didn't really know that there was that big of a market for selling those things in the hobby. But it was definitely an open door to bring in some revenue to literally subsidize costs, because it's still no matter whatever sell, it's still trying to just basically pay to keep the lights on type of thing. And it also is a huge avenue for education for me, which is really important. Not only is starting my own company and moving away from having a job where I have to work for a corporation and have a boss, but I can make my own schedule and kind of decide how I want to spend my time. And so being able to educate both people who keep these animals and teach them kind of what's been successful for me. What I've definitely made plenty of mistakes for certain things that just unsure of how to keep, and I've perfected certain aspects of it. And so I'm continually changing and learning and adjusting how I do things, trying to find more efficient, better ways to do things. But being able to educate is important. So I also I'm an adjunct instructor at a local community college, so I teach part-time for biology labs.
Okay.
So I teach usually about 3 or 5 biology labs a semester. And that also gives me an opportunity to work with young adults and hopefully inspire some creative minds to pursue the sciences.
Right. Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I think with the with the education piece, I think even just from like a keepers, appreciators, collectors, wherever you want to put people in the hobby, I feel like we've put people in this tunnel vision. A lot of us have, and the tunnel vision being on like 10 to 20 species, and people only associate like I'll take like OBT. People see an orange tarantula and everyone's like, oh, it's an OBT. Oh, it's got to be bad. It's got to be dangerous. Where realistically, I mean, there's New World tarantulas and other spiders that are orange that don't have, the same type of, toxicity associated with them. Or like, even like from the conversation, I know, like when I got to meet you in person, we were talking at NARBC, we were talking about the scorpions, and I'd always been given this information about certain genuses of scorpions, like, oh, this is going to automatically put you in the grave, this, that, the other. And you're like, well, like not necessarily. Like there's these different components, and this is how you got to think about it when you're keeping them. I think that's a huge aspect. That we almost sometimes we scare people away from parts of the hobby versus giving the appropriate education there, and then letting people make that adult decision.
Yeah, there's definitely an aspect, especially I think in the tarantulas, for instance, you have that new world versus old world.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of times the hobby has, as a person new to the hobby, they might keep a few new worlds, but then like, oh, how do I jump to that old world aspect? And don't get me wrong, there's definitely a lot of parts of it that deserve respect and how you work and handle things.
Yeah.
But there's new world species of tarantulas that give me more of a pain to deal with than a lot of these notorious old world species.
Yep.
for the most part, if and again, this is a little anecdotal, so I'm not going to this is just
Right.
my own personal experiences that I've witnessed. It's not nothing scientific or a proven study, um, but a lot of how you house these animals, the space that you give them or provide them, and whatever is in there, the more comfortable they are, the less likely they are to act in a defensive manner when interacting with them, whether it's opening the enclosure or working with them. So if those tarantulas tend to feel more secure and comfortable in their surroundings, they give me less heartache than maybe something that is flighty because it doesn't really have anywhere to hide.
Yeah.
And that's also when operating a work within a big kind of bin for kind of a secondary, I don't have like a bathtub where I lease my space, but I use big Rubbermaids and things. And it's even as simple as something that I actually clutter the bottom of those secondary bins with stuff, whether it's paper towels or some moss and things. Because if anything gets out of that primary spot, then they're going to instantly go down, just hide underneath that stuff, versus try to jet out of your secondary container.
Yeah.
So that's another aspect. I think that's something that's kind of easy to do, but yet it's not necessarily and this is stuff that works for me. It might not work for somebody else, but it can be kind of counterintuitive on like you're putting stuff down there and it just disappears. Well, at least it's still in the container versus coming outside and exposed. So there's those little things here and there that I think just over time picking up on and figuring out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously you've got true spiders, you got all your different, tarantulas, new worlds, old worlds. You've got your scorpions. I mean, is there one that you favor, over the different ones? Is there one, species across everything? And it could be the centipedes too. I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, I feel like that's another part of the hobby that all of a sudden we're seeing, exponential growth and people are starting to get interested in.
Yeah, this is hard. I think black widows will always have my heart, given that's kind of the first true spider I used to keep and raise up. And there's a few different species of black widows that I keep too, and so those will always be kind of true in my heart. My first scorpion that I ever had was a death stalker, so just an Egyptian death stalker. So I always appreciate those. It's tough to really. I mean, it's kind of like I like certain species because of certain things. So like for scorpions, I think the coolest looking scorpion is the Scorpiops genus. Kind of they look almost just like
aliens,
scorpion aliens. Yeah, they're real wild looking. Just they're very like cut lines and shaped claws, and so they're kind of unique scorpion, and they range from really small to like half-inch like body size for adults, all the way up to some that get like 3 inches long. So that's kind of a neat aspect too. The centipedes is something that I've definitely caught some love for, and I've only recently started keeping centipedes, probably in the last like 6 months, more heavily. And I wouldn't say necessarily I was slightly intimidated by trying to deal with them. And so I kind of was like, and also like a lot of them are really expensive. And so I didn't, as far as care wise, I didn't want to jump into something that was really expensive and be a little uncertain on as far as care. And so, kind of worked my way up and quickly realized like, wow, these are really awesome. Really cool behavior, really cool, different sizes, different colorations. So I've really taken a liking for those. So yeah, I've definitely expanded the species of centipedes I've kept in the past few months.
Yeah, and I think for people who don't realize, like, I mean, some of these centipedes are, $600, $800. Like, I haven't messed with centipedes yet, but I see them on the table and I see them on lists sometimes when I'm looking to bring stuff in. And like, I see ones at wholesale prices that are $500.
Yes, yeah, that's definitely Yes, they are expensive just to get into. But there's also, a very select few people that are working on more, captive, captive born options, and captive bred. You get these wild caught adults in, and I think it's important that when they're, you have those wild caught adults in, they have babies, to really work on trying to establish those captive born ones and raise those to adults and try to continually breed. Because I think that's, it's, I think in general, the arachnid hobby is in a bit of a problematic spot for the amount of import. Not necessarily like, more so with like reptile importers that are bringing wild caught reptiles, bringing a lot of wild caught arachnids, and it's almost just like those are just kind of filler to fill space in the box. Right? So and you have these countries essentially pillaging their native arachnids, and we've seen some ramifications to that too. With certain species that you can no longer import. Countries have stopped importing. Whether it be Chile no longer allowing export of their arachnids, or Brazil, which is never allowed. So there's certain aspects I think that are countries that really kind of tightened down for good reason on what they allow out. But there's also countries that from an economical standpoint, it's probably beneficial to some of those individuals from a job standpoint to collect and send out. But that's where I think the education part comes in. Is trying to educate people to maybe look for captive bred over wild caught, especially at reptile shows. Again, those wild caught arachnids tend to be filler species. Then with reptiles. That get shipped in, and you have not only these animals live a really terrible life to get to the point of where they're at for that show table, but often mislabeled, and sometimes I've seen those mislabelings as bad as like an African fat-tailed scorpion, Arachnid bicolor, which is one of the most venomous scorpions in the world, being identified as an Asian forest scorpion.
Oh yeah,
being that crazy, or giving freebies of these things like a death stalker to somebody that you're not telling them. So those cases happen way too frequent for my life.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because this is now I think it'd be 3 NARBCs ago for Tinley. I had someone, they had gotten their first tarantula and they're looking to get a second. I said, well, can you show me what your first tarantula is? I said, oh, it's a Brachypelma auratum. I said, oh, that's pretty cool. And they show me a picture and they're like, yeah, look how orange it is. I'm like, bro, they sold you an OBT. And true story. Yeah. And the guy goes, well, what does that mean? I go, that means you got an old world tarantula. He had no clue on any of that, and I think that's, like you said, is that, it's a horrible life. Like, I know at least like on the lizard side, like Morocco. So Morocco has a ton of Euromastics. I mean, I know they'll send people out in the desert of Morocco and they'll basically say it's like same as like $50 in the US and be like, here's $50, go fill your bucket up with euros and come back. I'm sure it's probably similar for some of the Moroccan fat tails and stuff that are out there too. Go find as many as you can, throw them in a bucket and bring them back.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's definitely that aspect, and don't get me wrong, like I buy wild caught animals, but I only buy wild caught animals with the intentions of establishing a species that I can't get captive bred or to be captive bred in my facility. I do I'll sell some wild caught stuff on my website. I'm very clear what's wild caught,
right?
And it's always just if it's stuff that that I'm working with to raise up,
right,
produce on facility.
Right.
Otherwise, I don't just buy. Really, there's honestly not a single species that I keep that I buy just to turn around and sell.
Right.
So no, it's always stuff that I'm personally working with and raising up.
And I'm the same way. I mean, I think for the most part, I think people don't even realize too, like with some people, like, you know, yourself or even me to a lesser degree. I mean, when I bring something wild caught, I mean, sometimes I have to buy them because they're not established in the hobby. You got to buy them, but you got to buy them at like a dozen because it's the only way to make it like worth your while. Because otherwise, you're buying one or two, it doesn't cover the cost to be able to fill out your wholesale pricing for the list. So
Yeah.
you have to. You have
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, and I do think that there can be a level of ethically collecting and selling wild caught animals too, and I'm sure there are some of that going on, but I see too much of the opposite of
Trying to make
just
a quick buck.
yeah, collecting and sending out, and it's tough because it's a business, right? There's a lot of money tied into it.
Right.
And so when some of these things happen, it's a dramatic effect on really somebody's job. But really, so it's not, not having the expectation this is going to go away. But at least, I have the expectation or desire to help, be a part of the solution and educating to help reduce a reliance on wild caught animals for the hobby, especially stuff that's readily available captive bred in the hobby and still being bringing in wild caught stuff. And that also goes for native species too to the United States.
Right.
And so I think that's from both sides of whether it be reptiles or arachnids. So I don't I guess I don't necessarily think negatively of people that sell wild caught, but I also hopefully people are open to having a conversation too.
Yeah, I think that there's a balance is really what you're getting. I mean, there's a balance and there should be a rhyme, a reason, and a purpose to it. I'm one of those people too. I always believe. I mean, at the end of the day, these are live animals. I think we can't trade them like Bitcoin, guys. So I'm gonna make a tech joke like that, but yeah, I mean, I think that's one of I think the really unique things too. I mean, when you go on your site, I think like you mentioned too, just some of the rarer species, and obviously it's in the name with Arachnid Rarities, but I mean, there are a lot of species that realistically, I mean, I'll say like sometimes like you're the only one where I'm seeing them that they're captive. The only other way I can find some of these, like when I'm looking at either some of these, scorpions or different spiders and stuff, is like you're getting them from an import. So I think that's that's a hats off to you to obviously putting in the hard work on that. Because there are a lot of people that just they want to skip the steps. They don't understand that importance. But like you said, I mean, as soon as those imports close, there's not another option. So if we don't start now, we're not going to have that available in the hobby. And at least for someone like me that enjoys random, really weird, out there, spiders and arachnids, that's sad if there's not a captive option.
Yeah. The best example of that's with the emperor scorpion. Pandanus imperator. And I mean, so those have not really been allowed to legally come in for a few years. And they might be maybe a CITES species, but what's happened is that they do come in. They come in as under different scientific names, and vice versa. Things that there's an issue where stuff arrives, and goes through Fish and Wildlife under a species name, and some of these are close enough to like on the surface. If you just glance at it, or you don't know what you're, don't have expertise and identification, you won't be able to tell the difference. They just pass on through. The problem is then they go into, being distributed to pet stores, still wrongfully identified. People think they're buying an emperor scorpion and it ends up being, a different species or vice versa. Something came in as a different species than actually an emperor scorpion, but they were so plentiful at such a cheap cost as adults that almost everything was just they're always there. And so people just sold them real cheap. The pet stores, you can buy them real cheap. But nobody was keeping them in large amounts to establish them captive bred, right? And they're slower growing species. So to try to raise one up to produce them, the amount of money it takes to do that is way more than what you could sell them for at the time, because again, they're always readily available. This goes for flat rock scorpions too.
Yeah.
Out of southern Africa, these flat rock scorpion species, where those take even longer, right? 10, 12 years to reach maturity sometimes.
Yeah.
On these, they were available. You could buy them for $15, all over the place. And then all of a sudden they stopped exporting them, and then no one captive bred them in the United States. And so now people like, gosh, I want these. Oh, you used to get these so cheap back in the day. Yes, because they're all wild caught. Now that doesn't exist. And you have a small few groups of people that are just clinging on a few and trying to find pairs for stuff. But we'll never, I won't say never, but we're a long ways away from being able to meet the demand of people that want those species and be able to produce them captive bred and supply the hobby for those flat rock scorpions or even some of those emperor scorpion species. So it really goes to show that's it really goes to show to just kind of put the work in, even though it might not be financially beneficial, but something that you're truly interested in and want to keep, stick with it and try to produce these things in captivity.
Oh yeah.
Otherwise, and I think that goes for reptiles too. I think there's reptiles that there's examples of that situation.
No, 100%. I mean, I think I think back like my Aphonopelma, which was given to me by a buddy who did a lot of the hard work, and I appreciate him when he got out that he gave it to me. But my Aphonopelma moderum, it's the only species I keep in there. For anyone who knows, Aphonopelmas take forever to grow up from little tiny slings. I mean, she finally just matured. And I mean, if I look back at that between, when he had her as a sling all the way back to then now when it's been given to me and now she's finally mature, it's like, man, I went through 2 keepers and a heck of a long time of years just to get her finally mature. But like you said, if you really like it, it's worth it. It's worth it. I mean, I'm still growing up the other side. It's going to take another, probably, 10 plus years till I get a male, knowing my luck. But, I think that's part of it. Same things with anything like G pokers and stuff too. Well, not as rare. I mean, it's still a waiting game.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes it, at the end of the day, it always seems like, it has to make finance. And again, I don't necessarily blame, some of these companies, because ultimately it has to make financial sense,
right?
In order to pursue some of those items. And it is different. Like, I have definitely stuff that I keep for personal reasons, but at the end of the day, I can't just go buy a bunch of stuff because I like it. It has to make, business sense. Either has to fit into a research project that I'm working on or wanting to pursue, or make sense in regards to being able to at least break even.
Yeah,
these things.
Yeah,
because otherwise it's just an expense. And research in general is just an absolute expense,
right?
And so at the moment, I think kind of tailed back a little bit on talking about as far as the species and what the research that's been done. I've put in so much work to kind of build up what I need for species to research on. And now kind of at the point we're doing these venom extractions, and really a lot of it is the venom extractions. I keep that venom stored for later use when I have the financial means to do some of these projects, because being a startup biotechnology company, there are some grants you can pursue, but grants take quite a bit of resources to write out and get that funding. So I have to try to get that funding from other means as well to kind of to put towards some of those research projects. I try to do some collaborations with other academic institutions or professors, looking where we can kind of help each other out in that manner for some research projects. And then I also do some contract research work as well. So pharmaceutical companies and animal health companies, I provide services to them either in the form of consulting, So
Okay.
consulting with vaccine development, or consulting with like animal welfare, and then also developing different analytical assays as well. So I'll do analytical assay development for certain companies looking to create a test in order to measure the amount of a certain protein or a certain vaccine component. So I'll generate those tests for that. I also generate like different antibodies
Okay.
that are specific towards different viruses or bacteria or whatever they want those antibodies to. And a lot of that work too coincides with some of the different methodologies and concepts for research when you're developing these diagnostic assays or diagnostic tests to basically be able to say, like, say if you get bit by a brown recluse, or
Right.
if you think you got bit by a brown recluse, being able to have a reliable diagnostic test to say, oh yes you did, or no you didn't, those sort of things.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, the other thing too, I mean, just so the general public here watching kind of knows, I mean, how long does on average take? I mean, a whole research project. I mean, is this usually span over roughly, is it 3 years, 5 years, 18 months? I mean, what does that look like? I'm sure there's some variation depending on what the goal or the outcome is, but I think
Definitely
that's
years. Yeah. So, I mean, if I were to, like, let's say I want to develop a new anti-venom
Mhm.
treatment for, or even just anti-venom in general, and I take that idea for creating the anti-venom and then going through all the regulatory pathways to get that approved.
right.
Um, Easily, I think 5 years would be conservative on the amount of work and timing. Now, you can accelerate certain aspects of that development in regulatory time. And there's other aspects, that you have to account for that, might take longer than that.
Right.
And then money wise, you're talking easily probably another like $3 to $5 million for a single product.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money. It's
Oh
a
yeah.
lot of money.
Well,
Um, and it's really why a lot of pharmaceutical companies have backed off, making anti-venom or providing that anti-venom. Um, so you have different companies that provided, I can't think of the product, but it was the African anti-venom for like 10 different
no,
species.
like the big generic one. Yeah.
Sanofi Pasteur that made, and they said, hey, we're not going to make this anymore. I think a company in England or Great Britain had bought the rights to that or technology transfer for that.
Yeah, was that
Um,
was that GlaxoSmithKline or something like that bought it or
no, it was a smaller company. I think I
okay.
didn't have to go back and look at the
Yeah.
details, but instead of putting the work into right, and that was a product they were selling, they just said, hey, we're not going to make
Yeah.
this anymore because they can make basically a hyperimmune serum to rabies. That
Okay.
was more financially. It was made more financial sense than they make more money off that product
Right.
than they were the antivenom. Um, and again, it has to make business sense for those companies. So they're going to put their focus right into products that are going to make them money. They have investors and shareholders that they're accountable to. And so that's how they dictate, where those resources are going. As far as that money goes into research and maintaining those products. So you have a lot of companies that are bailing out of making these anti-venoms because really the people those anti-venom serves are typically more impoverished areas
Yep.
or underserved areas that don't have money
Right.
for those treatments or
The
very little.
Yeah. Otherwise they go to a zoo on the shelf as a just in case.
Yeah. Yeah, so it kind of, I've always kind of described this whole thing that I'm trying to find first world money to solve some third world problems.
Yeah.
And it's difficult. It
And
really is. And so that's where I look at, like, okay, can we look at some of these venom components and utilize them for biomedical research, whether it be a cardiac drug or a blood pressure drug or a diabetes drug. Or like the something along those lines, which is going to provide more money, and that then will help subsidize costs
right.
to make some of these products and research and develop these products that are for really the people that I truly want to help.
Yeah, and I mean, and let's just highlight it here so people don't realize, that generic anti-venom in snakes. So roughly every year, folks, around 30,000 people get bit by venomous snakes in sub-Saharan Africa alone and die from venomous snakes. So around 30,000 people each year get envenomated, every year by some type of venomous snake. So in sub-Saharan Africa, that obviously these anti-venoms help to, stop. I think the other thing you hit on is obviously generic anti-venoms. I know even in like the US, not so much on the arachnid side. I think on the arachnid side, I don't know if anyone even documents it. So they only seem to document it on the reptile side. Because for venomous keepers on the reptile side, you have to have it documented when you file all your paperwork in a lot of states, whether that be Indiana or, Ohio and stuff. You have to document where the closest anti-venom is. But 9 times out of 10, it's just generic anti-venom. And realistically, like I know some of the species like the squams and stuff, like the generic anti-venom, I believe, isn't going to do anything from my understanding.
Yeah, so there's definitely species that are kept in the hobby, the venomous reptile hobby, that there's not effective anti-venom from. And there's also, a lot of people keeping things just assuming if they get bit, that they know where, that the anti-venom just come from a zoo or something along those lines. What people need to realize is that zoos keep just enough anti-venom for their employees that work with those animals.
Right.
That's it.
Which is usually about as many as we can count on one hand, folks. If that.
So if somebody gets bit, a private keeper gets bit by an exotic snake, and they have to pull from stock, anti-venom stock from a zoo, then essentially that takes stock out of the zoo that's intended for their employees that work with those animals. So that becomes a problem. Additionally, a hospital charges that person for that anti-venom. Very rarely does the zoo receive any compensation from anybody on providing that anti-venom.
Correct.
So it's not like the hospital's like, hey, thank you for letting us use this anti-venom. Here's X amount of dollars.
Payment.
I think rarely they receive any kind of compensation for that. So then they have to, go and replenish, and some of those anti-venoms are imported from other countries, and that's a process, to put in to import a biological product. So these anti-venoms are usually derived from a horse serum or a goat serum or something along those lines. And so it's a process, a permanent process to acquire more. And so it's definitely something that's I think been relied a little too heavily on in the venomous reptile community. Now there's also a really big push in the venomous reptile community that's fantastic to see, and individuals that have kind of led the way to show as an example of the process that you can go through to acquire your own anti-venom and store your own anti-venom just in case, so that I love seeing that aspect of things, and I talk with a lot of those people. And it's definitely something that, I'm hoping to get a little more involved with as well as making, being a part of making that process, more readily, making anti-venom more readily available to take pressure off of the zoos and other places that keep that anti-venom, and allowing for, basically storing in a different manner. For individuals that do keep venomous animals.
I mean, I think that even goes across everything, even as well as like marine and stuff. I mean, because on the marine side, I mean, let's face it. I mean, there are multiple people that keep marine creatures that have just as nasty of a venom, and it does happen, folks. People do get envenomated. I do know someone who has been envenomated by a stingray. Justin, if you're watching, how's it going? So, I think people need to realize, I mean, there's that aspect too. Because, I mean, I'll highlight that. I remember when that happened. I mean, the hospital just even looked and they said, oh, we don't know what to do. The hospital just goes, we don't know what to do. And obviously, with that species, it's just pain management and you'll survive as long as it's not a secondary infection. But, I think that's the other part of it too, is just, as far as the keeping aspect of it, making it more readily available, making a process so that people are going to especially keep it to a large degree. It definitely obviously makes it easier for those responsible keepers as well. Otherwise, like you said, it either puts the hospitals or the zoos in a stressful spot, or realistically, accidents happen. It could put the keeper in a bad spot too, depending on where you live in the US. If you live in Montana, you might not get anti-venom in time. I mean, let's just be realistic.
Yeah. And it's definitely, I think there's, I think it's easy to think about some of these, like especially like venomous snake bites, right? So worldwide, I think it's well over 1 million plus people. I'm trying to think how many. I think it's well over 1 million plus people that get bit by venomous snakes every year.
Yep.
And about 125,000 people worldwide die. And then I think even more impactful is that around 400 to 500,000 people have life-altering consequences from those envenomations, right? Whether they have amputations or have permanent damage in some manner that affects their ability. Again, like I kind of mentioned before, on even just contributing to their economy at a local level over time, and so it's not even necessarily the deaths are bad, but just the sheer amount of people that are permanently injured because of this is really detrimental as well. They go from being a contributor to their economy to being essentially an expense or a cost we have to, they're taking from the economy on requiring care. And that's where I think, better treatments, more efficient treatments are not necessarily, even some of these species where, you're probably not going to die. But the chances of, having life-altering effects from it are significant. So finding ways to reduce that is really important too. So it's not just about necessarily saving lives. It's about preserving your well-being enough to where you can still function day to day. Without those effects.
I think you highlight, I had read, this is a month or two back, and I forget what the numbers were, so apologize, folks, but it was kind of astounding to me that in northern Mexico and southern Texas alone, how many people step on tricolored bark scorpions per year, and then by stepping on them get stung, and then the percentage of them that end up having a bad reaction that actually go to a hospital. Now, it's not a species that realistically usually, puts someone in the grave or, causes them, significant harm. But, it does give some people certain allergic reactions with the venom that it does make them, hospitalized for, 24, 48 hours. And I just find it, you think about that and you say, okay, that's not a harmful species. Well, what happens when I'm walking somewhere, whether it be in Sri Lanka or somewhere in rural India or Northern Africa, where there's scorpions all over the place? I could easily step on one. Most of those places, folks are, wearing some type of an open-toed shoe. So you're kind of, you don't really got the protection there if you step on something. And 9 times out of 10, I feel like realistically, when I think about it, I could probably accidentally step on a scorpion, not realize it maybe in the first 5 seconds until you start feeling the effects of the sting.
Right. Yeah. And with scorpion envenomations, again, we have these scary things like death stalkers, what a common name, right? And for the most part, if you're healthy adult, you get stung by something, again, it really could ruin your week. I do think the chance of mortality is a little overblown, right? That's not saying they definitely kill healthy adults,
right?
But maybe not as often as what you would think that they would. Where the real detriment is to children, elderly, and the infirmed. In northern Africa, there are certain species that with children 5 and under, or children 5 and under, or children 9 and under, the mortality rate from some of these scorpion stings is 60%.
Right.
Right? Even in Mexico, with some of these bark scorpion species that are in Mexico, where you have 20 to 30% mortality rates with children that get stung or elderly that get stung. So those are some where the big issues are.
Right.
And what you'll see is what's really interesting too is like we have a lot of species that even I keep that like really we don't even know that much about the venom.
Oh, yeah.
And there's really not been envenomations, to know about, because a lot of these species are found in areas that are not populated or very low population with people.
Right.
So where you get the big stings are usually where those species coincide with large populations, and that interaction is increased. Similar to like with the inland taipan, nobody really gets bit by the inland taipan because there's not a lot of people up where they exist, or that the chance of interaction is greatly reduced. So similar thing with arachnids, and that's also something I'm looking at, trying to do a better job of characterizing that venom and have a better understanding of that venom of these species that just have not been really studied much.
Do you think at some point, and maybe this is something you're working on, do you think at some point that it'll either be there or there will be a scale where there can at least be some type of like envenomation scale, because right now I really feel like that there's not one where someone can kind of put a number to it. Me being a number guy, I feel like people like, what do? You go to the doctor and they say, okay, well, how bad's the pain in your wrist? Because you're going up your wrist. Okay, well, rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. If there's something like that from envenomation, even like, do you think that there will be some type of a scaling like that where they can kind of start to show, different neurotoxin species and cytotoxin species, just kind of where those, rank and where kind of the differences is, and like the proteins and the peptides that kind of show how each one kind of, adjusts or in a sense changes that, toxin to or toxicity to a different level?
Yeah, I definitely think, there can be a correlation of a higher percentage of the venom being a certain protein or a certain enzyme is
Okay.
results in a more severe reaction.
Yeah.
The other thing too is, and this happens with snake bites, is that no venomous snake bite is really the same. Right? There's so
Okay.
many factors that go into how much venom has been delivered, what of that venom, what is the percentage of whatever proteins and things that are in there. Same thing with scorpions. You get stung, it could be a dry sting. Their primary use of these venoms is for their prey.
Yeah.
Secondary is for defense purposes. So
All right.
they don't always inject venom when they sting, and sometimes they inject a lot, sometimes they inject very little. Another thing which makes scorpions interesting is they can actually control how much of the different protein concentrations and enzyme concentrations that they inject too. So
Okay.
that's a whole nother realm of interesting, where that they have a way where they can actually kind of select how much of certain different types of what that venom is even composed of. So that's a really interesting concept.
And that is interesting. That's something I didn't know. Do you think that then they have like the cognitive ability, like that they're able to, or some type of sensory ability that they can tell depending on what they're injecting in, what that chemical makeup needs to be? Or
Yeah, and that's something that again, that's a really complex topic,
yeah.
and even something that I can't even begin to try to speculate, how that's
No
done,
worries.
or what there are some thoughts and ideas, but maybe a sting that's more on the defensive side. They might choose how to utilize that venom differently than something for prey,
Right.
and but in regards to literally how that works from even just a cellular standpoint on how they do that, I think is still a little unclear. So
Yeah. Yeah. I know we've talked a ton about the venom stuff. I mean, when we look at obviously all the breeding that you do, I mean, roughly, I mean, how many species are you breeding, on a year in and year out basis? I mean, are we looking at, 30, 40 species? Are we looking at, I mean, you have over 100 species of scorpions. You got
Yeah.
around 75 species of tarantulas here and spiders. So there's a lot going on. I mean, do you just kind of go through like kind of a rotation and say, I'm going to focus on, these 30 or these 40 based on kind of where certain projects are at? Or
Really, if I have, especially for scorpions, if I have mature species of male and female, then I'm making an effort to produce them in captivity. That's probably some numbers I could probably go through and like, okay, yeah, here's how many broods I've had this year. Here's how many species that I've produced. But I think as far as I think I've captive. Now there's a difference, right, between captive bred and born and captive born. So,
right.
For the most part, like I make an overt effort to captive breed and have those babies born,
yeah.
right? I would approximate probably between 40 to 50 species of scorpions that I've produced, captive bred and born in my facility. True spiders are probably, I do a lot of true spiders. So I've definitely done quite a few of those, continually captive breed those true spiders. Tarantulas are probably the least amount. Like I think I've only successfully produced a sack of Erminia. So, and it's not to say like I like tarantulas, but of all the stuff I keep, they're the least interesting to me.
That's totally fair. I mean, like I feel like I'm like the opposite. Like I've produced the most tarantulas, true spiders. I've had hit or miss, and they just seem to give me headaches sometimes. Like huntsmans give me a lot of headaches, but that's another story.
Yeah, I think true spiders are trickier to produce and keep going.
I was gonna say it's the first like 4 or 5 instars. I always feel like with true spiders, as soon as you get the sex, the first 4 to 5 instars with those versus a tarantulas, where it's like, man, I feel like it's like if I'm late one day on getting to food or to water or something, like you see like, well, there goes 5 of them or something. You just slowly, they seem to be a lot like so much more delicate. Huntsmans, I think once they're full grown, frankly, are pretty hardy, but I feel like in those first like few instars, like instars, 1 through 5, is realistically where I feel like I see most of my casualties, from a true spider perspective.
Yeah, and I do think that like it's like for black widows, for instance, right? They have an egg sac, a few hundred babies in there, or sometimes certain species have smaller numbers.
They just
there's always going to be a level of there's always going to be a level of those species that just have a percentage of those young that are failure to thrive.
Oh yeah.
And so there's just an intrinsic mortality. So even like for black widows, usually I'll keep the whole sack together for a little while, even let them kind of knock out some of the ones that weren't going to make it anyways, and beef up the stronger slings a little bit, and before I choose to separate. And that's different for each. It's just certain.
Right.
For certain species of black widow, I'll do that. But yeah, these huge numbers, you're always going to have a certain amount of those babies that just are failure to thrive. So they do tend to be trickier. And then trying to line up, when a male matures versus when a female matures.
Oh yeah.
Black widow male, you can get a male to maturity in like, just a few weeks almost, it seems like.
Yeah.
And so trying to time out getting a mature female line with a mature male can be difficult at times.
I'll make the joke here. Some people who know my basement know me well enough. If you ever need a black widow male, I've got enough running around him. I don't breed black widows because I just go to my basement and they're literally breeding in the corner themselves. I just leave them there. I was really upset. It was like probably around I think like May this year or something. I had a female black widow that literally right above my incubator where my snake is, she made a sack. And I was like, no, we're just going to leave her. Like, just leave her alone. And then I remember I was gone for a trip. I went to a show and I came back. When I came back, I went down to my incubator and I figured I'd check on the black widow. And there's a daddy long leg sitting there. I'm like, oh no. when we all know what happened. For people who don't know, daddy long legs like eating black widows, or at least in my basement they do. So they're gone. But I mean, I just always make that joke. There's black widows running free roam in my basement all the time. So if you need a male. But I mean, yeah, I mean, you work with so many different species, I think, from a breeding projects perspective across, tarantulas, scorpions, true spiders. I know we hit on a lot with the venom research stuff. I know we're kind of went a little bit over the hour here, but I kind of want to leave that time open. Obviously, if there's anything else that we didn't get a chance to hit on, obviously that you wanted to, obviously kind of bring to light, talk to, people to kind of hear about. Otherwise, I'll kind of open it up. I mean, if anyone wants to ask any questions here, others we'll kind of wrap it up here for tonight. That way, Brandon can actually get some sleep before tomorrow.
Yeah, I think we covered quite a bit of it. I don't have anything to expand on. So
yeah, no, right. Yeah. But I mean, folks, if you haven't already gone and, checked out both, Brandon's, Verve Biotech site, which you had running the first half of the show, and the Arachnid Rarity site for the second half of the show, definitely go and do that. Go check it out. Realize that, a lot of the purchasing from the Arachnid side definitely goes to help, further this research, which does a lot of great things, both from a biomedical perspective, but also just for advancing the hobby, advancing the knowledge, advancing sciences out there, advancing educational aspects out there. So definitely make sure that you go ahead and do that. Support his product, support his brand. This is something, from my perspective, that's very, very groundbreaking, something that's very important to the furthering of our hobby, to the furthering of sciences and biologies in general. So please make sure that you go ahead and do that. Otherwise, from my side, this is Nick Karaskedge with The Tread. It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to kind of bring some of this knowledge to the forefront and have people to be able to experience this. So, I really appreciate it, Brandon. This was awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yep. And folks, definitely try to tune in next week. We have not released our guest yet, but stay tuned. See y'all next week. Take care. Thank you.